world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back here on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Friday, December 5th, as you are listening to this. Now, yesterday we had a special treat. It was the joint Rational Boomer and Analytical Iowan Podcast. I hope you guys all enjoyed that. And I'm probably going to do things like that more often. Maybe from now on, when I do my appearances on the podcast over for Mike on the Rational Boomer, I might just see if we can do it the same way, do it as a joint effort. And that way you guys get that experience as well. Now, we got a lot to talk about today. As I said, today's Friday, December 5th, and we got a ruling yesterday out of the Supreme Court. It was on the gerrymandering case for Texas. Now, you may remember Texas has been trying to gerrymander the hell out of their state. They redrew their maps. They were the first state to redraw their maps, and they tried to edge out 5 democratically held seats. Now, a lower court ruled against the state of Texas in this case. It said it looked like they were very clearly racially drawn maps, and that they were not allowed to be used. Well, Supreme Court came through and said, yeah, we're going to stay that ruling. And it was a very short ruling. It was like 5 pages long, or 5 paragraphs long, not even 5 pages, compared to the 160-ish pages of the lower court's ruling. Now, what does this all mean? Well, it means for now, that Texas can go ahead and be planning on running the 2026 election with those maps. And this just means the Supreme Court is going to take more time with this, and they're going to slow this way down. And now there will probably be a ruling coming out in May or June about these maps. Here's the problem. By May or June, primaries will have already been done. All of that would be done. Ballots maybe will already have been finalized for November. Maybe not. I don't know what Texas's actual cutoff is. I know some states cut off in June, July, or July, August, somewhere in there. Because remember, that was what happened last year with Joe Biden stepping out of the presidential race when he did after 3 weeks of pressure from Democrats. They were up against a 10-day window to get a replacement before states started finalizing their ballots, and Joe Biden was going to be on that ballot, whether he was in the race or not. So the whole thing is suspended right now as far as Texas's case. They get to use their new maps. Now, what does that mean for California? Because remember, California redistricted as well. They did it in response to Texas, and Governor Gavin Newsom turned around. He took it to the voters, and the voters passed it with a big margin. It was like 67, 68%, something like that. And these new maps are going to phase out 5 Republican-held districts in California, basically offsetting on a federal level what was going on in Texas, so it would keep the balance. Well, if they ruled that Texas was okay, then more than likely California is going to be okay. So while it is a loss in Texas for now, it is probably going to be a win for California. Now, I thought California was going to be a win either way, especially when you consider how Gavin Newsom went about doing it. He took it to the voters. They did a referendum. They redrew the maps. They put the maps out publicly first and then said, do you want to use these new maps? Whereas Texas just went to the legislature, redrew the maps, did it very, very quickly, and then called a special session of their state legislature to push it through. Now, Texas state Democrats did try to block it, but unfortunately, they have very little power in the state house. Now, Texas does not have a Republican supermajority, I don't believe, but it's pretty dang close. And Texas Democrats were able to prevent it for a little bit, but they knew they weren't going to be able to keep it going forever. They were just trying to delay it and draw attention to the issues caused by these new maps. So, that being said, Supreme Court looks like they are siding with Texas at least temporarily. This is all just an effort to buy the time needed to get to 2026. Now, this could backfire for Republicans. How? Well, let's look at what just happened in Tennessee. Okay. Tennessee just had that special election on Tuesday night. Now, while we are still disappointed about the results and Afton Bain did not win, she only lost by about 9%, considering Donald Trump won that district by 22% just a year ago. That is pretty telling. Well, when you redistrict the way Texas did, what you would have done is taken, you know, shrunk that majority and you would have shifted voters around so that win for Donald Trump that was 22 percentage points, maybe it would have only been by 12 percentage points. Okay. So you just took out 10% of the electorate that were Republican and swapped them with Democrats. The thinking behind it is saying that you are going to end up having everybody vote the same way they voted before, and you're still going to win. Now, you're just not going to win by the big margin that you won before. Okay, so if Donald Trump would have only won that district by 12 points, and Afton Bain picked up 13 percentage points in the polls, in that case, if they would have gerrymandered that district like that, pulling those voters out to maybe try to shore up a Democratic district and make it one that could flip, Afton Bain would have won that district. That is how gerrymandering can backfire. That is called dummy mandering, where you end up shifting your voters out and it costs you the seats that would normally have been safe for you. Now, in my opinion, most of the gerrymandering is still illegal and shouldn't happen. And both parties do it, don't get me wrong. Now, in some states, I think it was Massachusetts, and somebody, if I'm wrong, correct me in the comments. Um, but I'm pretty sure Massachusetts is basically solid blue. And they said there's basically no way without extreme gerrymandering to draw the districts to where you would have even one majority Republican district. Like it would have to be a very convoluted and weirdly drawn district to make it um, a Republican led district because Massachusetts is just very liberal, very democratic. That's different. But you look at some of these states where they have, almost S patterns, or it looks like you just drew a squiggly line and you call that your district because um, that's what you need to do to get the voters you want to represent in that area. That is not how, in my opinion, districts should be drawn. Now, Iowa's not quite as clean cut as it used to be, but we do have an independent commission here in Iowa that does draw the maps. It is not very partisan. Um, and with Iowa only having four House seats, rather six electoral votes, but four House seats, it's pretty easy to divide Iowa. You basically draw it down the middle on going both directions, cut it into quarters. It's not quite that simple, but it's pretty close. Um, and that makes it pretty easy, pretty fair. I think all states should have it pretty much independent. They should be redrawn, and once drawn, as long as there is no other issues like courts say no, these are illegal or whatever, they should be set. This decade redistricting is not typical. Okay, typically we only redistrict after the census. Now, the census is done every 10 years on the decade. So, next one would be in 2030. And then in 2031, they would recalculate population and they would turn around and say, okay, based on population, this is where the seats need to go. Now, one of the things I think they need to do, and they looked at doing this all the way back at the beginnings of our country, but the way they talked about doing it in the beginning um, wouldn't work today. They wanted one representative per every 100,000 people. Well, we have 330 million people in this country, roughly. That would be 3,300 roughly uh, members of Congress just in the House of Representatives. That's a little excessive. Now, one of the things I thought of potentially we could do, but this would probably take a constitutional amendment. Maybe not. Maybe they could just do it with a law because right now the current limit is set by a law that it is capped at 435 members of Congress for the House and two senators per state, so 100 senators right now in the Senate. If we were to admit Puerto Rico, for example, if they became a state, would get two senators, and I think they would get 7 members of the House of Representatives. Those 9 seats would be taken from other states. Some of your higher population states would actually get less representation, um, and then they would end up giving representation to Puerto Rico unless they changed the cap. Now, what I suggested a while back was what, because this would come out to about what we have now, is every state would get one representative per every 750,000 people population, um, rounded up. So if you ended up with 750,001, you round up. And it would, yes, it would occasionally increase the numbers of Congress, but then you don't end up with where, oh, well, this state grew in population. Sure, they're getting an extra seat. But one of the arguments is that some states have, the population per representative is not equal in every state, right? And I forget the exact numbers, but it is something like 40,000, no, 400,000 people, I think, per representative in California, something like that. But you get Wyoming's got one for like 600 and some thousand, something like that. I don't remember the exact math now off the top of my head, but I think that would be fair. Now, as far as one of the things I am seeing people talk about, since we're talking about about population and everything, would be that I've seen people talking about this idea again. Why is the Senate only 2 senators per? Well, the Senate is 2 senators per state to balance the states against each other. It makes small states, large states all equal as far as population and landmass, because that way you have one chamber where population doesn't matter. I've seen people suggest, well, we need to change it so that it's based on population, just like the House. Problem is, it says in the Constitution, anything can be an amendment except changing the equal representation set up in the Senate. Now, the way that reads to me is if they decided to make it 3 senators per state or 4, that you could do that. But every state would have to have the same number of senators. Now, making it by population defeats the purpose of the Senate because, for as much as it should be majority rule in a way, if the majority of the country leans one way or the other, that they should be able to get their way, we also don't want several states to be able to control the entire country because they're the only ones who would get the majority of the representation. Look at California in the House of Representatives. They have, I think it's 50 to 52 members of the House, something like that. Texas has got 33. Between those two, they have almost, or they have about 40% of what it requires to be the majority in the House of Representatives by themselves. Now they don't agree right now. They are on different sides of the political spectrum. But still, two states have about 40% of the seats required to have the majority. You add in New York and Florida, and you're right up there with having just over half of all the seats required for the majority. And that's four states out of 50. You're talking 8% of the country. Now, I know that's not the same as what it would be by population, but um, still, the whole thing, we cannot separate out that equal representation for the states because otherwise, some of the states would not get their way. They would not, and it's not necessarily about getting their way, but getting things represented for their own states. Now, I talk a lot about Chuck Grassley, right? And I can't stand Chuck Grassley. The dude's been in the Senate longer than I've been alive. He is 92 years old and gonna run for re-election, at least right now, claims he's running for re-election in 2028 at the age of 96 years old. Well, well, he is going to be 96 and he wants to run for re-election. Okay, fine. Well, with that being said, when he's doing that, he is going to end up, but with him being 96 when he runs for election, there's a good chance he doesn't make it to the end of that term. And he is going to end up passing in office. But anyway, one of the things about Chuck Grassley, with him having been in the Senate as long as he has tried at least to push forward some things for Iowans. Okay, one of the things that really helps Iowans is the Farm Bill, and included in the Farm Bill is things like subsidies for farmers. Um, there is credits for taking a year off and not planting and letting your soil rest, which actually does help your crop by not over farming the same areas, and for crop rotation and all of those kind of things. That there's subsidies and tax credits for all of that. He also pushes pretty hard for uh, funding for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which again helps farmers, and crop insurance and those kind of things. And now him being only one voice in 100 actually helps Iowa by being able to have equal representation to other states and to bring those issues forward. So we don't need to back off on that equal representation per state. That's just my opinion. But as far as constitutionally, I don't know that they could end up changing it because the Constitution is very clear. It says we can't do that. So that's kind of where that is. Now, with this gerrymandering rule, though, with this ruling from the Supreme Court, like I said, it's not going to be their final word on this. Okay. They are going to ultimately rule on these maps, but I fully expect they're going to try to drag it out and take their time and make it last as long as they possibly can before they issue a full ruling. By doing so, they are going to end up trying to side with Donald Trump if they can. And even if they don't, and they ultimately end up ruling against Texas, if they drag it out too late, they'll say, well, it doesn't really matter for 2026, but you guys will have to change it back for 2028. Now, if they do that, that's going to cause a lot of chaos and a lot of confusion when it comes to who represents what district and where and all sorts of things. So I don't know what they're ultimately going to do here, and they may still come back with a different ruling, one way or the other. This isn't over as far as it goes, but it is highlighting that we need to do something with the Supreme Court. Now, Donald Trump was up Truth Socialing the other night, and he was rage tweeting, talking about how bad it was going to be if Republicans lose control in the midterms and how Democrats are going to pack the court to 21. I did a TikTok on that he was terrified of the idea that Democrats would pack the court to 21. Well, it's entirely possible that Democrats need to seriously consider this idea of packing the court, that they could end up ultimately deciding that they have to do something with the Supreme Court and making it so that they have more justices in the Supreme Court. Now, personally, I think it should go to 13, and that would make some sense because you have 13 district courts, one justice per lower district court. Makes perfect sense to me. And they have to do some other things to fix the court. We have some people on there that don't need to be on there, who have lied under oath to Congress about certain things, specifically about overturning Roe v. Wade. You have all 6 members of the conservative side of the Supreme Court that said before Congress, when they were asked in their confirmation hearings about Roe v. Wade, did you believe Roe v. Wade was settled law? Are you going to overturn it if you get a case? And they all came back and said, nope, Roe v. Wade is settled law. We're not going to overturn it. There's nothing to see here. It's done. And yet, the minute they got a case in front of them that could overturn it, they overturned it. So we have to fix the Supreme Court. Don't get me wrong. There are plenty of issues there that the Supreme Court has brought on itself. We need to put in a code of ethics. We should not have a Supreme Court that is able to take all of these expensive trips, these luxury trips, get gifts on private jets, and go to sporting events that most people would never be able to attend or afford tickets for, and sit in luxury boxes and do all of these things, get these vacations paid for. There is a problem with the Supreme Court, and we need to work at fixing it, but it's not also the most pressing problem. We are going to have a lot of things to fix when Democrats get back in power. Now, if they take the House and the Senate back, like I think they will, they could end up taking the House by 40 or 50 seats, maybe more. And if they do, they need to start holding public investigations into everything that is going on. And this administration is not going to like all of the things that comes out during these public investigations. They are going to end up doing things like having investigations into Cash Patel. We hear about Cash Patel using the FBI basically like a private service, and that he appointed a team of FBI agents to be a security detail for his girlfriend, who, until we heard the story about him appointing the Secret Service agents, I hadn't even been aware that he had a girlfriend, or why does she need a security detail? Who knows, other than maybe he's trying to do something big and flashy to impress her. I don't know if there were any credible threats against her. I hadn't heard of any. But spending money for that, and then he was spending money from the FBI using private jets to fly his girlfriend here and there, using it like a taxi service for himself. And now the story comes out that he is also using FBI agents to just drive her home, things like that. The problem here is that that's not what the FBI is for. They're supposed to be investigating criminal cases, investigating crimes on the federal level. So, with that, Cash Patel is very clearly not doing his job. Now, he could end up being one of the first people that ends up getting cut from this administration. We have heard that come the first of the year, Donald Trump is looking at potentially changing some people out. Now, Pam Bondi may be on the chopping block, Cash Patel may be on the chopping block, and some others may ultimately end up going. Pete Hegseth may actually end up going too. We're going to talk a little bit about that situation with the boats here in just a little bit. But if Donald Trump decides to start removing these people, he's going to have to get new picks through Congress. Now, if he's going to do it, he'd better do it quickly, Because if Democrats, and it's possible that the Democrats could pick up enough seats to control the Senate. If they pick up the Senate in 2026, once they take over, Donald Trump is not going to get any crazy picks through, period. They're not going to get through. He's going to have to pick pretty reasonably minded people, and they're going to have to be uh, pretty tame picks. Otherwise, the Senate wouldn't agree. If Democrats are in control and for whatever reason, let's just say he hadn't appointed RFK Jr. to Health and Human Services yet, but Democrats were in control of the Senate. No way RFK Jr. gets through. Doesn't happen. Things like that. They would have to pick good people. And I don't know if he can find any good people to end up being around him. Now, I mentioned Pete Hegseth and this boat situation. Okay. They're doing bipartisan investigations into Pete Hegseth over this. And there's talk that Democrats are going to bring forth articles of impeachment against Pete Hegseth. Now, it would not take very many Republicans to break ranks and agree to impeach Pete Hegseth. And if these articles of impeachment pass, if they do, and they try to impeach and remove Hegseth, I fully believe, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, that if the Republicans decide to break ranks and impeach him, then it will probably pass the Senate. Because this would be different than what happened with Donald Trump when Republicans broke ranks and sided with Democrats. During Donald Trump's second impeachment, where some Republicans, I think it was two or three, sided with Democrats and voted to impeach Donald Trump the second time for January 6th. Well, with that going on, they were able to get away with it because there was enough Democratic votes. It was going to pass regardless. They didn't need to vote for it and know it was going to pass, so they could vote in favor of it and say, "Well, I stood with it on moral grounds, but it was going to pass anyway." They could sell it to their voters. And this time, they don't have that covered. They're in charge. Democrats are not in control of the House. They're not in control of the Senate. Republicans are in control of everything. So they have to be able to end up ultimately convincing their voters that they made the right choice. And I think they can do that if they turn on Pete Hegseth and say, okay, well, here's the thing. He clearly violated multiple federal laws. We had to remove him. Now, this whole situation becomes even more bizarre. There was an inspector general's report that came out that said they were looking into the whole Signalgate problem. Remember, Pete Hegseth with Signalgate turned around and said that there was this thing going on with Signal, the unsecure messaging app, where they had people in there that shouldn't be seeing classified information. They were sharing classified information over non-secure sources, all sorts of stuff. Well, this inspector general's report came out and said yes, he was doing that. He was sharing classified information over unsecured networks, and that people who shouldn't have seen it had access to it, and that Pete Hegseth was involved and knew what he was doing wasn't right. That's not a good look. And that they're saying that it could have put servicemen and women's lives in jeopardy. Couple that with what happened with these boats, and you have the fact that they're trying to walk it back and say, well, Hegseth really didn't know. He didn't catch all of it. He wasn't even watching it live. He watched it on the news or whatever story they're going with. I don't buy any of it. I believe Pete Hegseth actually knew what was going on, and he probably watched the whole thing. That they blew up this fishing boat and claiming it was a drug boat on its way to the United States. Had 11 people on it. Well, apparently there were some survivors, and they double tapped the boat and blew it up again and made sure that there were no survivors after being told by Pete Hegseth to, quote, kill them all. So the whole thing is kind of, it's a bad look for this administration. Well, Donald Trump had a chance to walk away from it. and say, no, that's not what we support. Pete Hegseth wouldn't do that because I wouldn't support it. And he has said things like that in the past, but he was asked very directly, I think it was yesterday, in the Oval Office. And Donald Trump comes out and says he's asked about it. And of course, he could have said no, but he didn't. When asked if he supported Pete Hegseth in blowing up these boats and potentially blowing up survivors after you've already blown up the boat. And he said, well, no, Pete Hegseth was justified in what he's doing. You're going to find out that this is war, and that's what you do in war. That they're killing millions of Americans every year, and he went on his typical rant about the drugs and calling it poison and all of this. Um, but the thing is, how do we know that they're drug boats? They've offered no evidence other than claiming it is, just like they've offered no evidence about fentanyl coming in from Canada, but they just repeat it again louder and louder, and they think that they've got a win here. And Donald Trump says this is war. Well, I've talked about it before, but what Pete Hegseth and what the Department of Defense, because I refuse to call it Department of War, should do in these situations if you have a suspected drug boat like that is they should wait till it hits U.S. water, have the Coast Guard intercept it, search the boat, seize any contraband, and arrest the people involved because they would have the authority and try them. That is how you deal with that. That is also called due process. Now, this administration doesn't believe in due process, not at all. So, what are they going to do? Well, they think that this is fine. And now Donald Trump comes out and says, well, you're going to find this is war, and we're going to start land operations soon. As with everything Donald Trump says, couple problems. One, the president does not have the authority to declare war. That resides with Congress, specifically, I believe, the Senate. And we have not actively declared a war since December 8th, 1941. We've authorized the use of military force in varying instances, uh, going in as part of a UN peacekeeping force during the Korean conflict. We had uh, our time in Vietnam. Again, it was authorized military action, but they never actually declared war. Um, we had our time going in as part of the UN during Operation Desert Storm, which was we went in to protect uh, Kuwait, and then we had Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then whatever the mission was, whatever they called the mission in Afghanistan. Those were all authorized uses of military action by Congress, but they weren't declared wars. And now you have Donald Trump sitting there in a press conference saying, well, you're going to find this is war. Well, really, if it's war, then um, why hasn't Congress declared war? And who are we going to war with? The country of Venezuela? Are we going against the cartels? Who? He won't. He'll probably say the cartels, but how do you declare war on a group that's not a country without declaring war on the country? It's very hard, especially when you are not invited in. Now, we did that with the Taliban in uh, Afghanistan, and then they went in and they had we were there for a long time because it's very hard to get rid of groups and ideas like that. It's not the same as fighting an actual country. Now, we are hearing reports that Russia is sending members of their military. I heard the Wagner Group was one of them that is going to be down in Venezuela as potentially a show of force or to get the United States to back off, something like that. Well, here's the thing. If they're doing that, if they are sending a military force down there, right? And if things escalate, that is actually going to be, while not a good thing for the United States as a whole. I don't want to see this erupt into a world war or anything like that. Don't get me wrong. But from a military standpoint, if Russia is involved and they are sending actual trained, uniformed military troops, that is going to make things a lot easier for the military. If they get involved and they are actively being combatants, it makes targeting very easy because you have groups that are wearing the same uniform, etc. It makes who you are looking for easily identifiable. Whereas if you're just dealing with the cartels, like Donald Trump seems to think is what they're going to do, they don't all wear the same clothes. They don't wear uniforms or etc. It is hard to know who is or who isn't a target. So, you know, as much as I don't want to see a new escalation, I don't want to see a new Cold War, anything like that. If this does happen and it does break out, at least that would be easier on the military from a tactical standpoint of them being able to figure out who their targets are. But again, I don't want to see anything break out. There's no reason for us to go after Venezuela. And this is coming from Donald Trump, who wants to be the so called president of peace. He ran on a campaign of being the peace president, of being the no new wars guy, right? He didn't want to have any new wars. He didn't want to have conflicts. Hell, he said he would end the Russia Ukraine war in 24 hours after being elected. Well, we're 13 months post his election. It's still going on. The Israel Gaza conflict is still going on, though it's not getting nearly as much press. It's far from over yet. It just looks better for Donald Trump at this point because the media is not talking about it. Now, Donald Trump has got a lot of problems. Okay. And once again, he has been trying to fight this image of him being asleep, of him dozing off, of him being the dozing Don Snorleone. Some of the nicknames are great, and it's driving him crazy. Donald Trump spent years going back to 2020 referring to Joe Biden as Sleepy Joe Biden. Now, why did Donald Trump start the whole Sleepy Joe Biden? Well, it's because Joe Biden decided to listen to medical experts during the height of a pandemic and say, yeah, there's no reason for us to hold rallies. We're not going to hold events. Uh, the experts say we need to stay home, stop the spread. And in fact, to avoid, uh, you know, spreading COVID or contaminating anybody else in his household, he even set up an office and a workspace in his basement so that he could do things uh, in his run for the presidency that didn't involve, you know, running that risk of spreading COVID. But see, when he didn't leave his basement, when he was doing all of that, Donald Trump used that against him, saying, "Oh, well, he's just Sleepy Joe, doesn't even know where he is. He won't leave his basement, like he was a chicken or something like that." When in fact, Donald Trump was the one doing all sorts of super spreader events and not social distancing, not listening to experts, because he was convinced that the pandemic was going to cost him the election. Now, he was correct, but not in the way he thought. Donald Trump, if he would have handled the pandemic correctly, could have cakewalked his way into a new term, a second term. Would have been done. He would have had it. He could have come out right off the bat and said, you know, the experts are saying we need to shelter in place for like 3 weeks to a month or so. We're gonna flatten the curve. We're going to get ahead of this thing, and we're gonna do everything we can to make sure it doesn't become a massive killing event, etc. And then he did that at first. He's like, yeah, we're gonna give it a shot. Then about 2 3 weeks in, realized how bad it was. The economy was tanking because nobody was shopping, nobody was spending any money, nobody was making any money. And as all of that was going on, um, he said, "Okay, we got to get the economy open again. We got to open the economy. We got to open the economy." And then started freaking out, and then tried to spin it so that it was the Democrats' fault for everything being closed and tried to do all of this. If he would have done things the right way, he would have gotten a second term. But Donald Trump has been so desperate to point out that Joe Biden was Sleepy Joe and was unfit. He spent 4 years attacking Joe Biden about how bad off Joe Biden was, that there are people that still believe it. And Fox News and places like that did not help when they would show things like a poorly edited clip where the one I talk about a lot is probably one of the worst ones, where it is a clip. If you look at the Fox News frame, Joe Biden is just standing there looking off in the distance and looks like he's talking to nobody. But then we see the same clip from somebody else, from a different news source. And it's a little farther back, it's zoomed out, it's not as close or not as edited. And you can very clearly see Joe Biden talking to somebody. Well, the other half of that Fox News clip is then when it's time for Joe Biden to be, you know, take his spot doing whatever, wherever he needed to be at that event. This was at a cemetery in Normandy, I believe, for D-Day. Uh, Somebody comes over to Joe Biden and kind of says something to him and says, "Okay, we need to go over there now." And like you would when it's time for an event to move on to its next course. But he was in the middle of a conversation, so they went over instead of just yelling at him across the way or whatever. They went over and just said something to him and got his attention. But Fox News again cuts the clip and makes it look like he's having to be led to where he goes. Like he's got no idea what's going on. He's just here talking to nobody. They have to drag him along. But the full clip again had him having this conversation with somebody else. That is a big difference. But it's just another example of how the media has not helped us here. But Donald Trump has been desperate to characterize that Joe Biden was the sleeping one. Yet we're seeing Donald Trump sleeping in public. It is happening, and it is happening a lot. Now, I think he was just at another event just after dozing off at that cabinet meeting the other day. I think he was at an event yesterday too. And he no more gets done with his part, and he's pretty much done talking, and he's dozing off. He's sleeping. Now, why? Well, a couple of the reasons as to why Donald Trump's day, he starts later in the day than most presidents. He doesn't even, I think, get up till 10:30. He works 12 to 5 or 6 per day. That's about it. And this is based on the official logs released by this administration trying to show how hard a worker Donald Trump is, not realizing that it actually proves the opposite. But that's typical with this administration. They fuck up on a regular basis. Now, Donald Trump dozing off in public is part of it, but one of the reasons he's so tired is because he is sundowning. And typically, when you start sundowning, you get your nights and days mixed up. And usually, there comes a point in the night, and if you're not asleep by that point, you are going to be up most of the night. And then you doze deep, then you sleep deeper into the morning. Now, Donald Trump was never a night owl like this in the past. This has been a new progression probably since he became president, because in his years in the business world, he would have to be up and at 'em, and dealing in the world of business and real estate and everything starting at 8 a.m. For being the businessman that he claims to be. That would be the typical, day, 8 or 9 in the morning. But now that he is getting older, he's suffering the effects of age. He's starting much, much later, ending his days earlier, and then he spends half of his night being up, rage tweeting and things like that. He is not well. He's not a well man. Now, ultimately, I don't think he makes it to the end of his term. There are going to be multiple things that come out, and it is going to end up wrecking Donald Trump. Now, he's got a lot of things hanging over his head, and I think ultimately either the stress of all of it's going to get to him, and he has some big event, something they can't deny, whether that is an actual stroke on live TV, whether the Big Mac gets him and he has a heart attack on live TV, something like that. I think they are going to try to prop him up for as long as they can, unless public opinion turns on Donald Trump. And if public opinion turns on Donald Trump while he is still cognitive, while he can still rage tweet, and Republicans decide to move away from him, he will burn the Republican Party down in the process. Now, what does this look like? Well, if his health just goes and they have to do something, especially if he's not cognitive enough where he can't communicate, he can't rage tweet, he can't hold interviews, um, then Republicans are going to get by with one. They'll use the 25th Amendment. J.D. Vance and the cabinet would go through and say, okay, clearly he's not getting any better. You know, he had a stroke on national TV, let's just say, if that's the way it goes. You know, he is not well and he can't be president anymore. That's what they would say something like that. If Congress agrees, he'd be removed. J.D. Vance would become president. But if they decide to do something else, and I think the other thing hanging over Donald Trump's head is the Epstein files. Now, we haven't talked a lot about the Epstein files the last few days because we've had other shit going on. And but some video came out about the from Epstein Island. It was a tour of at least part of Epstein Island. And this is bizarre, right? I think part of it was to show how opulent the island really was, what was all there, you know, how big and massive it was. But I think part of it is just showing potentially what horrors and tortures were potentially done on the island. Now, Donald Trump does not want the Epstein files to be released. He has been fighting it at every turn. Now, he has been trying desperately to keep things from being released, even though, yes, he signed the law that would require it to be released here in about 2 weeks. And I know Donald Trump in his 2 weeks, but the actual time frame is just about 2 weeks. Anyway, um, Donald Trump wants to get rid of the Epstein files. He does. He doesn't want to talk about it. That's hanging over his head. Now, I still believe that depending on what comes out with the Epstein files, if there is anything damning about Donald Trump, and depending on how bad it is, the Republicans will use that as their vehicle to get rid of Trump. Why? Because that MAGA base that they think would normally not turn on Donald Trump does care about children, and that they would actually care enough that if Republicans stood up and said, yeah, we can't support Donald Trump anymore because he's on the Epstein list. He did all of these things with kids, and there's proof and pictures, etc. Donald Trump would be embarrassed to the point where, of course, he's going to lash out and everything else. But the MAGA supporters might actually be willing to turn on Donald Trump because they do care about kids. Now, I was talking about this video that came out, and the whole thing is really weird as they're doing this walkthrough. One of the things that was shown, which is very bizarre, was that there was a dentist chair on Epstein Island, and they're very weird masks all over the walls, right? Now, what I don't know is were the masks used by anybody in the room, like they were doing some sort of sick games with the victims involving pretending to be a dentist, and then they would wear the masks so that the girls didn't know who was abusing them. That's possible. Were the masks there because there were dentists there doing, dental alterations? maybe trying to alter dental records so that, you know, because that's one of the ways they identify remains is if you can't, use facial recognition, if you can't use fingerprints, if you can't, depending on what you have left for tissue samples, if you can't use DNA or there's no way to use DNA, you use dental records. Could they be doing alterations? And because this was a trafficking deal, the other thought I had was, these victims stayed with Jeffrey Epstein at the island and his other residences, etc. Could it have just been there for routine dental, just to keep up their appearance of having, perfect teeth, etc., making sure that all of their dental needs were met? Now, that seems a pretty benign reason for this dentist chair to be there, and it probably was. Um, there was probably way more nefarious things going on, and we're going to probably find out what those were at some point. But the whole thing is this: there's more and more video. Now, this last one wasn't as big of a deal, uh, other than just showing us what was some of the things that were there. There wasn't any victims. There was no uh, names that I saw of any of the clients there. But as these things come out, the Republicans are going to be considering it, and they're going to be looking at all of it, going, do we move on Donald Trump now, or do we wait? The whole thing is not good. Donald Trump knows it's hanging over his head. He doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want this to happen. And of course, they're going to try to do things to mitigate what comes out with the Epstein files. Now, I know they were trying to get judges to release grand jury testimony and the grand jury evidence. Here's the thing: typically, stuff released to a grand jury through a grand jury proceeding is sealed. It is bound by court order. That way, um, they can turn around and the grand jurors are protected from being identified, and we don't know what was actually presented. We only know what was presented at trial. And but the thing is that information, just because a copy of whatever document was presented to the grand jury, doesn't mean that's the only copy, right? The FBI could still just release the files that they have, and that stuff would get out to the public. It's just for the ways of evidence and the normal court proceedings, judges typically don't break that seal. Now, we will see if they end up doing that, if they end up breaking the seal of a grand jury testimony and allowing this stuff out in the public. But I think the reason this administration is trying to do that is so that they can spin the narrative and say, see, I was trying to be proactive. I was trying to show you guys everything. I wanted to be transparent, but dang it, those judges blocked me. Now, as far as releasing the rest of the files, I think they're going to try to do something to block them. I think they're going to try to claim active investigation or national security or something like that. But enough people in Congress have seen them, and enough members of Congress have said, if this administration fucks around with the files, they are going to release the names that they have um, out on the floor of Congress. The list of, clients that the victims gave, the ones that they know for sure. And that's not going to be good for anybody involved. Hmm. So Donald Trump wants to get rid of the Epstein files. They don't want to deal with it. They want it to go away. It's not going to go away. And I think Republicans, depending on how bad he fucks around with the files and what public opinion looks like, they may use that as their way to get rid of Donald Trump. But if he's still cognitive, if he's still able to tweet and give interviews and stuff, he will try to burn down any and all Republicans with him that he views as disloyal because they turned on him because of the Epstein files. All right, so that's going to do it for today's episode of the Analytical Iowan Podcast. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today. Of course, I'll be back tomorrow with even more because there's always stuff to talk about.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan Podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.